been spending quite a bit of time on Zoom in the last 3 or 4 years. And so I'm used to going on into a deep dive into lecture mode on Zoom, talking about nerves and arteries. But I would love to talk in an introductory way about what I'm doing. And I think you have some questions that you were preparing. What
I
was
do.
the first thing?
I just love to know more about your journey and what piqued your interest. What led you down the rabbit hole of neurovascular study? What's some of your history with it?
Yeah. Well, I finished my SI training in 2005, and Tom Myers had invited a friend of his from Munich, Christoph Summers, to come teach a visceral class. Right away, I mean, I was fresh out of the gate in terms of being a new structural integrator. And honestly, I didn't get a lot out of the class first. It was much more subtle than I had been used to working. And I learned a few new things, but I knew that I wanted to begin working more subtly. And then the next summer, Christoph was actually teaching a nerve class. And so that was my first nerve class in 2006. And I felt, again, like I got some things out of it, but I wasn't really getting the subtlety of it, the osteopathic style work. And then I studied with a structural integrator who was also a chiropractor. He's passed away, Don Hazen, and he brought in some of his understanding of the nervous system from his chiropractic training and putting it together with some other people's things. And what I really got out of his class was slowing down and having a chance to really palpate and feel nerves. So that was a great gift from him. And then I took another class with Christoph, and then I started studying with Jeffrey Birch, who's a Rolfer who teaches in the Barral style. Christoph also taught in the Barral style. And I did a bunch of visceral classes with Jeffrey Birch, and his introductory class on functional methods, which is about basically many different ways of working with slack and tension in a subtle way. And we as structural integrators are always working with slack and tension, which I'll talk more about in a minute. But in the context of that class, I learned a little bit about working with arteries, which just happened to come up as the thing that was needed with one of the students that I was working on. And artery to trapezius was the first thing he showed me. The artery to trapezius comes off the subclavian artery, which heads out to the arm, and then it runs over the shoulder like an overall strap, and it goes down the back all the way through the whole trapezius. Part of it goes to upper trapezius, but mostly it goes up over the shoulder and back. And on the way back to trapezius, it supplies the scalenes as well. I didn't know this at the time, but so there, I learned a really specific, complicated way to get a hold of the tissues and stretch specifically that nerve, and then the trapezius just melted. And it was actually very quick. And it was surprising. And I started to realize, oh, when I'm working with nerves, sometimes I'm actually working with vessels. They respond differently. And so that was a big aha for me. I think in my initial nerve classes, somebody had said, well, sometimes the muscles are hypotonic and sometimes they're hypertonic. And since then, through working with Jeff, I learned that actually that hypertonicity is often indicating that it's tension in the vascular network that needs to be addressed. And often when you're working with a nerve, because nerve, artery, and vein run together as a neurovascular tract, you're intending to work on the nerve, but if it has sort of a melty quality when you're working on it, it's actually probably you're working with the vessel network. And that, the way I describe it to students and clients is that the neuromotor system has been tightening up the muscles to protect that portion of the vessel network. And once the neuromotor system recognizes, oh, it's not a dangerous challenge to the vessel system to receive this super gentle stretch, I can actually let go, then you have less muscle tone. So it's like you don't have that protective muscle tone. I'm exaggerating my own body's pattern. You know, it tends to lift this shoulder and bring the head over to the ear. And I trace that protection, even though fascially, yes, my shoulder goes down, that tendency to protect there is connected to some old injuries, probably from skiing, that really, big crashes that yanked the vessel supply into my head and into my arm. And they've gradually opened up, and that network has released, and I can stand with my shoulders not hiked up to my ear, but if my nervous system senses there's danger, it crawls up there anyway. Anyway, so that was my first vessel that I ended up working with, and I did a bunch of other work with Jeffrey, including taking clients to see him in his office, where we would occasionally do two-handed work, or he would just show me what he found. I would do my osteopathic style listening and show him what I found, and he would show me how to work on it. Anyway, a lot of mentoring. And at this point, it's hard for me to say which artery techniques I learned from him. Sometimes I remember specific moments like, I got that from Jeff. And there were other things that I ended up making up along the way. So those were my main teachers in nerve work. And in 2010, I had the I reached out to John Martin, and he invited me to do tableside assistance in a couple of his classes when he came to town. And so I've certainly been influenced by his work too. Marilyn Beach, who some of you know her name, she was actually the first person who encouraged me to teach. She said, well, come teach us some nerve stuff in the place where she lived. And so I went to teach a nerve class, and I realized actually, as I was preparing the material, it's like, gosh, this is at least half arteries. Do I dare teach a class on arteries? I haven't even taken a class on arteries, and it ended up being, I finally owned up to the fact that, okay, I was going to teach a class that was at least half arteries and half nerves, teaching it at the same time, because a lot of the times, yes, if you treat the nerve, you are also treating the artery, but many times if you are turning your attention to the artery network instead, you get a different and better result. Sometimes those things are, nerves and vessels are running exactly together, and sometimes they're not running together. Like the nerve to trapezius comes off the subclavian artery and goes that way. I mean, the artery to trapezius, but the nerve to trapezius is a cranial nerve. It comes out of the head, and so it descends down through the jugular foramen before it heads down to the trapezius. So how I would approach the nerve to trapezius and the artery to trapezius would be very different. And there's a cutaneous nerve that runs over the top of the trapezius, the supraclavicular nerve, that follows that same pattern. And if it's tight, it would limit movement just the same way my right trapezius would limit head rotation if it were tight. If the nerve that comes down over the clavicle in that same pattern is tight, my body will also limit my head turning. So there's different layers to think about, and you can go down the nerdy rabbit hole figuring out, where does this thing come from? But a lot of the work comes down to identifying what is the just right amount of tension or slack to get a release in the system so that the body allows turning. Nerves are very fascial. They can feel like strings or threads within the tissue. You can find them with your fingers. Much in the same way, if you had a dinner napkin, like cloth napkin lying on a table, but there were a loose thread underneath it, if you were palpating and touching that napkin, you can feel where that other thread was underneath the napkin. And that's a lot of time what you're doing when you're turning into nerves within the superficial fascia is just palpating and feeling, where are the strings, right? But nerves also have their own blood supply, and there's some lymphatic supply into the outer layers. And if you treat a nerve as if it were a vessel, as if it were filled with fluid, often you get a better nerve release. So one way to approach a cutaneous nerve is to land on it, like I'm going to pretend this is a cutaneous nerve, is to land on it in the tissue and go, oh, I think I feel that thread, that linear thing. And if you're palpating, especially near where it's emerging from the profundus, which is that body stocking layer around the muscles, if the nerve is emerging from that profundus layer and it's headed out to the skin here, if I'm palpating that place where it's emerging and then releasing, palpating and releasing, almost like you would press a sponge and then release the sponge to allow fluid to flow back in, you're going to actually promote glide of that nerve out from that fascial sheet. There's interstitial fluid flow that you're improving there. And I've actually seen it in dissection when you in the lower leg where I could tug on a nerve. This was in a freshly frozen body, tug on the nerve, and you can see it emerging and going back into the sheet of the fascia profundus. So releasing it where it comes through a layer can be helpful. Releasing a nerve where it's coming through this, exiting the spinal column can also be helpful, and can liberate movement. And for that, I often describe to a client that if you think of your brain as a beet root and the spinal cord as the tap root, the skinny part of the root, there are little roots that come off of that. Those are the peripheral nerves. And if those are stuck in the soil, held in the myofascia, say of the intercostal spaces, then it would be hard to pull that root out of the soil. So if I were going to do flexion, like going down into seated flexion, like for conventional back stripes and structural integration, if I were going to curl down and my intercostal nerves are held in the intercostal spaces, then my brain descending with my skull here is going to be asking the spinal cord to glide up through the vertebra like this. But if the peripheral nerves are held in those intercostal spaces, I'm going to have very little glide available. And in fact, it might feel like I've got a lot of pressure in my head, because instead of the spinal cord following the brain, the spinal cord is held and the brain is being pulled down in towards the frame and magnum, very uncomfortable. I actually have a nerve gliding or dural gliding exercise that I, after we've done some release for the intercostal spaces, is really integrative and useful for clients in helping. It helps regulate the central nervous system and orientation, because it's actually asking those peripheral nerves to glide into the spinal column and out again. It's like if you if you have a rusty bike cable and you squeeze a little oil in there, you have to work the cable back and forth a little bit to get it free again. So I've kind of been rambling, but so those are some few things about nerves and fluids that follow the nerve pathways. And I guess getting back to your basic question, what got me into this is that I had discomforts in my body that weren't quite resolved through regular structural integration. And I discovered that actually the missing ingredient for me and my body had a lot to do with the nerves and the vessels. And once I learned how to work with vessels, I got really excited about it. Yeah, and now I feel like it's really useful to teach vessels alongside of nerves, instead of saying, okay, you can just learn about nerves. Later, we'll teach you about vessels. It's really useful to be able to learn about them both at the same time. So that's the motivation behind my teaching.
I love it. I really liked how you described some of the different textures, which kind of goes into my next question with like,
Yeah,
what are you feeling and what are you sensing? As we talked a
right.
little before. Um, and I liked how you said sometimes when you're feeling for a nerve and you feel a melting, that might be
Mhm.
a vessel. Do
Mhm.
you have any other textures or sensations of what you feel with your hands when you're working with nerves and vessels?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I have to talk about a few specific examples in order to answer those questions. So, one way to work with nerves is to work with the nerves in that are more easy to palpate, that are in the superficial fascia. And when you're doing that, this part of your finger is actually a better part to touch with than this part. This is the active doing part of your finger, and it's not going to be as good at receiving information as this part. And if you even just touch your finger right now, you probably feel, oh yeah, there's a little bit more fine sensitivity when I brush this part of my skin versus, I don't know, that's kind of sensitive too. But trust me that if you want to palpate nerves, if you're palpating with this part, it's going to be a little bit easier than if you're poking with the tips of your fingers. So that's one tip. But uh, one of my nerve teachers, it was Christoph Summers, came up to me as I was earnestly looking for cutaneous nerves somewhere. I don't know what part of the body I was in. I was looking, and I was bent over my work, and he actually picked me up by my ears, and he lifted me away from the work, and he asked me to listen to the birds outside and to feel the back of my body, and uh, tune myself to my peripheral senses, which would make me more receptive, and the nerve would come to my hand rather than me searching for it. So that's a good tip for beginners too, if you're actually looking for palpating those different textures in the superficial fascia, is to be aware of your back body. Um, and 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 press with this part of your hand, and press and release. And that sponge idea that I mentioned, that will help the tissue textures come to you, and you'll be more aware of them. So that's if you just want to find the nerves. Another way to know that you're on cutaneous nerves that are potentially tight and irritated is that the standard sort of a SI technique that you might be using that's sort of broad, it might feel like you just go and get stuck and you don't travel anywhere. You're stuck in the tissue. It's often because um, there's cutaneous nerve or artery tension into that superficial fascia. And usually the way to work with it more successfully is to put a little slack in the system. So if I think about working on the front of a leg, um, either the lower leg or the thigh, a standard structural integration thing is to bend the knee and then let it come down to the table again. That sort of soft, knee comes up, knee goes down, or you might involve the foot too, knee and foot up, knee and foot down. And that knee going up is actually giving slack to the nerves and vessels in the front of the thigh, because the aorta comes down and it splits off to go to each leg, and all of the everything in the thigh gets its blood supply from the femoral artery that crosses under the inguinal ligament. So if you flex your hip, that's going to give you just a little bit of slack. There's a little softening, and the tissue may be more available to change. And then say you're gliding up, as the person sets their leg down, they're establishing more tension on the artery network while you're going up, which is still giving slack towards the heart. So it's this combination that knee bending and straightening is providing slack and tension the whole time. And that's one of the reasons why that's so powerful in structural integration. If you were on the lower leg and you were going up, and you just had a person flex their ankle, it might not be as successful as if they bend their knee, because the bending the knee actually gives slack between the place where you're working in the lower leg and the vessels in the thorax. So I remember when I was teaching structural integration, often we talked about not moving the body part that's really close, but moving something far away. Like, let's say you were working in the lateral thigh where you're like where hamstrings and quads are meeting. The vastus lateralis wraps around and attaches to the femur, and the hamstrings are running alongside. And let's say you want to be in the space between there. If you were working in there right near the knee, way down here, you could be you could be differentiating the space even just between the two heads of biceps femoris. So I came from a structural integration school where we were very nerdy and anatomy focused. I know that's not everybody's thing, but if I were just right in between those two parts of biceps femoris, that's a place where there's a nerve running out that goes down into the lateral leg. It's a common fibular nerve. And if I got a person to just move their ankle into dorsiflexion and plantar flexion, they would be putting tension and slack on that nerve. So even though I'm working above the knee, if I call for movement from the foot, I'm moving things subtly. I'm doing tugging, tension and slack on the nerve that's up in the territory where I'm working. And it's probably going to feel better both to the client and to you than if the person just bends their knee. So using distal body parts, moving those for client movement is also you're often unwittingly working with the nervous system or the vessel system. I know sometimes it's tempting to work with a client passively, and I think that has its place. Sometimes it's easier to palpate nerves when the client is passive because they're not a moving target. But there's a lot to be said for client movement. And I think that's what the osteopaths are missing out on, frankly. That client movement piece is still super important.
Other than the client movement piece, how much in the neurovascular work do you have client engagement? Like, is there aspects of safety or teaching with how to move like gently or slowly, or is there any type of dialogue there?
A lot of the work in my practice and in teaching is helping build interoception. So being able to feel into the little nuances. And so when you're doing subtle work or trying to teach people to have more of a subtle awareness of what's going on in their body, slowing down is helpful. Having moments where the person gets off the table, the classic, well, how does it feel to have your right leg worked on and not your left? And it's like, well, what do they learn from that? That really still has its place in doing neurovascular work in a huge way. It starts to teach them more subtle interoception, even if you start with something big, like everything on the right got released. And now do you feel the difference? It's a good starting place for having that slow build in interoceptive skills, and leaving time for integration is really important, like at the end of a session, rather than doing everything right up to the last minute, having some integrative time at the end of the session is really key when you're working with the nervous system in general. But you could talk about that from a biomechanical perspective, like what is happening if you ask somebody to sit up and let their eyes travel around the room looking for something blue, they might be engaging their whole neuromotor system to turn. You might give them a specific, like, deepen your left footprint into the floor as you turn, or move your belly button, whatever cue you are using at the moment. You might be getting them to slowly floss their intercostal nerves out of their spinal column as they do that. There might be like a biomechanical integrative thing about doing that that's helpful, but it could also be regulating a nervous system that has past trauma, and that just orienting towards the room and what's in the room is nervous system regulation. Checking out the horizon. This was actually another really important teacher of mine, Lael Keen, who lives in Brazil. who is an advanced role and did Peter Levine's full somatic experiencing training. She did, I took a couple of courses with her where she was teaching from that body of work to structural integrators about how to not get into deeply into working with somebody's trauma with, to a point that's not beneficial to them. To recognize when trauma is coming up and to figure out how to help them regulate their nervous system, and work with trauma without being a psychotherapist or a somatic experiencing practitioner. And so one of the things I learned from her is that surveying the horizon, checking out, it's like there aren't any tigers there aren't any tigers over there. Checking into the room, it's like looking and see, I might invite somebody to go look towards the calendar. This is something external in the room, but go to look towards the window. So it's like I'm orienting towards out there, and it helps somebody come out of a deeply internal experience in a way that's safe and is giving their nervous system a message that even though in some level I had a sympathetic charge from some of the work that we just did, now my nervous system is regulating itself. So before we started the conversation, you said something about you were interested in where my learning edge is. And I think working with trauma is a continuous learning edge for me. My clients are teaching me about nervous system work every day. And I'm hoping that is what I'm teaching to students too, is more about how to work sensitively with in a trauma aware way with people's nervous systems. I think even the vascular work is working with people's nervous systems, because the nerves have little sensors in the outside of those vessels. And let's say you're talking about carotid artery or vertebral artery going blood supply to brain. The body cares a lot about blood supply to brain. If those little nerves are sensing, we're going to get too much stretch on that thing, you might get a lot of motor protection that's going to disallow stretch. And if you can apply just tiny little bit of baby stretch where the nerves go, actually, that's all right. That's all right. I could allow that. Gradually, you get less and less protection. So I don't know. Even the vessel work is working with the nervous system. I think I got a little sidetracked again, but
well, you went right into the next question, and
yeah,
my dogs are going crazy, so I'm gonna travel with you.
Okay, well, I can't hear your dogs thanks to the Zoom filter.
There we go.
Yeah.
But I would just love to know, to end things off today, I know you probably have to go soon, but one thing I really loved is that you are offering online and in-person classes. So I just would love to hear a little bit more about it. We'll have a little in the page in the newsletter, but if you could tell us a little bit about your class.
Yeah. Well, that's a gift from COVID to me, was that the possibility, I didn't know that I could teach manual work online, and it turns out that I can. Actually works pretty well. But it allows me to access, give people opportunities, access to the curriculum without having to travel, which sometimes that's cost prohibitive if people live, on the other side of the world, that sort of thing. But it allows people to titrate the work into their practice. So instead of getting the big download in 3 days, they can spread it out over 6 weeks and gradually add it into their practice and come back for questions. So that's a big advantage. And then I'm doing in-person classes too. And some people are choosing to do both. I'm offering 2-for-1 prices. It's like you would pay for the class and you can come in person and take it online. So you could either come in person and then review it online, or you could get a start on it online and then take it in person. Anyway, there's benefits to both. They're both useful. My cycle usually starts in the winter. And so I've already done the in-person winter course is wrapping up, and I have the distance learning, and the in-person course is happening March 8th through 10. And then the next cycle begins the next year. So
yeah, I love anytime there's a good class. I usually want to take it twice. So I love that idea of doing distance and in person.
yeah, you benefit from both.
Well,
Yeah.
Kieran, this has been lovely. I'm so excited to rewatch the recording because there was so much good information to just play around with just in our short time. So thank you so much.
You're welcome. Thanks for the opportunity to talk with you and the Hellerwork community.